Viewing or listening to this podcast confirms acceptance of the disclaimer visible on your screen or found at authorscott.com/podcast. Welcome to the Regaining Health and Humanity podcast. I'm Dr. Scott Johnson, your guide on this journey to natural well-being. Here we explore evidence-based insights, revolutionary breakthroughs, and powerful health strategies that not only inform, but inspire change. Together, we'll uncover the mysteries of human existence and unlock the secrets to thriving. This podcast is more than just knowledge. It's your catalyst for unleashing extraordinary potential. Get ready. Your journey to boundless health and happiness starts now. Hello, my friends, and welcome to the Regaining Health and Humanity podcast. Do you ever feel like your cravings are controlling your life? Well, the food companies have designed foods to do just that. Keep you hungry for high-calorie, low-nutrient, and highly processed foods. That's why I've invited Dr. Glenn Livingston to the show to expose this craving game and to help us overcome these eating patterns that keep us in food prison and sabotage our health. Dr. Livingston is a veteran psychologist and was the longtime CEO of a multi-million-dollar consulting firm, which has serviced several Fortune 500 clients in the food industry. You may have seen his or his company's previous work, theories, and research in major periodicals or major media outlets. You may also have heard him on ABC, WGN, and or CBS Radio or UPN TV. Disillusioned by what traditional psychology had to offer overweight and or food-obsessed individuals, Dr. Livingston spent several decades researching the nature of binging and overeating via work with his own patients and a self-funded research program with more than 40,000 participants. Most important, however, was his own personal journey out of obesity and food prison to a normal, healthy weight and a much more lighthearted relationship with food. So welcome, Dr. Livingston.
Thank you so much for having me. Wanted to add one or two things to what you said.
Sure.
If you don't mind. I'm also a formerly obese person. I'm not just a doctor who wanted to work with overeaters. And I've got a long story about how I got out of that, but probably won't have time for that today. I also want you to know that my work with the food industry was about 25 years ago. So some of my knowledge, my inside knowledge is not quite up to date, but I've been working with overeaters, thousands of them for the last 10 years, and I can tell you that the less processed food that people eat, the easier it is to overcome their cravings because of all the things we're going to talk about today.
Now, that's quite a big patient population, 40,000 plus. And so that's a lot of experience, which I think is really important because we can talk theory and even research all we want, but unless it actually applies clinically and works clinically, then it's really not useful information. So I'm excited to have you on and to learn from your clinical experience in this realm.
I've worked with about 2,000 people, 2,000 paying clients. The 40,000 person study was an online study conducted over many years, a long time ago.
Yeah.
Okay.
Let's jump right into it. Can you help explain appetite control and how it works in humans?
There are a multitude of factors. It's overdetermined. It's kind of like a bathtub with a multitude of faucets. If you could picture a bathtub with 8 or 10 different faucets, and kind of depends what the overall temperature of the water is, depending on which of the faucets you have on. Certainly nutrition is a factor. It's one thing to understand how to control your thinking about food, and that's a lot of what I do. I help people to disempower their justifications for overeating and to set up these mental tripwires so they know when they're about to do it. It's one thing to do that, but if you are, eating donuts all day long and you're not really nutrified, eventually your brain is just going to crave and say, we can't do better. So you could be low in magnesium, zinc, chromium, amino acids, vitamins. These can all cause cravings for carbohydrates and sugar. I found in my practice that when people are not having enough leafy green or cruciferous vegetables, that they often start to crave salt. I don't know exactly what the mechanism is there, but I can tell you that is something I observe over and over again.
Mm-hmm.
There are hormones like ghrelin and leptin, which um, kind of tell your brain what your body fat stores are and what your nutritional status is. And ghrelin is lower in obese people and higher in lean people, and the opposite is true for leptin. Sleep alters the production of leptin and ghrelin,
Mm-hmm.
and it creates a reduced desire for exercise and energy expenditure. Can increase your snacking, especially late night snacking. There are peptides that are released after meals to inhibit food intake and signal satiety. Is insulin metabolism. There's serotonin, which suppresses appetite and increases the expenditure of energy. When you're stressed or traumatized, you have more of a need for serotonin. If you're taking antipsychotics, you can have a decreased level of serotonin. There's how dopamine works in the brain to connect food triggers like the donut store sign with the rewards like the donuts themselves. It kind of what bridges the gap between the trigger and the actual behavior and creates those seemingly automated behavior loops. There is a chemical called CCK that signals satiation.
Mm-hmm.
There are certain parts of the brain that control hunger, blood sugar levels, whether your stomach's empty or full. And, when it's cold, we want more energy to reinforce and maintain our homeostasis. And when it's warm, we have to expend more energy to sweat and cool down. So there are really a multitude of factors that go into your appetite. It's not just what you ate or what you saw on TV. It's complex, but there are some simple things you can do to make it better.
Yeah, it's obvious that the appetite signal and the way it works in human beings is quite complex, and there's so many different factors that we have to consider. And I think often too many people try to oversimplify it, and we need to consider all of these factors in order to really attack cravings and appetite. So that jumps right into my next question. Why do we crave these unhealthy foods sometimes?
Well, you need to know that the food industry is spending tens of millions of dollars on creating these hyper palatable concentrations of starch and sugar and fat and salt and excitotoxins. And it's really all designed to hit the bliss point in the reptilian brain without giving you the nutrition to feel satisfied, so that every time you're looking for love at the bottom of a bag or a box or a container, there's some fat cat in a white suit with a mustache that's laughing all the way to the bank. And, that these foods, they really dysregulate your system, the highly processed foods, and they create cravings for themselves. And then the advertising industry is superior at convincing you that you need these foods, that this is where the good stuff really is. Like, I once worked with a food bar manufacturer that took the vitamins out of the bar because they made them taste bad and were costing a little too much money. And instead, they put the money into the packaging to make them bright and colorful and vibrant, because in nature, if you come across a diversity of color, like a patch of purple cabbage and blueberries and green lettuce and yellow carrots, you're likely to get a diversity of micronutrients. But here in this situation, they're kind of faking you out. They figured out how to hit that evolutionary button that's going to make you crave that thing without actually giving you the nutrition there. And so your brain gets all confused and it keeps going after it because it's not actually getting what it needs. And, there's enough sugar and exciting chemicals in the food to make your brain continue to think that this is where the good stuff is. And so it leads to this, snowball addictive behavior loop that just goes down and down and down. There are a lot of food cues in the environment. A few food cue is just something that signals the availability of calories and nutrition. Like, in the primitive times, maybe a caveman would see a monkey and that monkey would lead him to a banana tree, and then he would gorge himself or take some back for his family. And in the process of doing that, his brain will have learned to release a lot of dopamine the next time that he sees a monkey. So he gets motivated to go follow the monkey to find the bananas. The brain will also torture him a little bit if he doesn't follow the monkey when he sees the monkey by lowering the dopamine, which corresponds to a very foul mood. So, that's part of the craving mechanism is the learning process and having had the experience of seeing the donut store sign leading to donuts or going to the poker game and having the pizza and the chips and the beer available. That, there are cues in the environment like the salty air and the sun on your face at the beach that's associated with ice cream. And so it's a question of what you've learned. And 100,000 years ago, cravings were a survival advantage. People think that they're sick or there's something wrong with them because they have such strong cravings. But the truth is, it's really just your healthy brain doing its job in a very sick food environment. Because 100,000 years ago, the people who didn't have strong cravings would have died out because they wouldn't have been motivated to go find the food that was scarce back then. You couldn't go down to the convenience store and get 100,000 calories for $100. You just couldn't do it. Now I could do that in 5 minutes and walk across the street and do it again. I think it was Ricardo Krishnamurti said it's no measure of health to be well adjusted to a profoundly sick environment, to a profoundly sick society. That's part of why we crave unhealthy food is because we live in an environment where it's ubiquitously available. And we also live in an environment where the way that people have learned to deal with that is by tacitly supporting each other to slowly kill themselves with food. Everything in moderation, a little won't hurt, just hand over the cheesecake and, nobody gets hurt. And everybody's laughing about it. Well, the disease is just rampant. Like diet reversible, preventable diseases are just rampant. Cardiovascular disease and kidney disease and, even some forms of cancer. They're just rampant. So you put it all together, the advertising industry, the big food industry, the cultural norms, the predominance of the availability of all these calories for so little effort. And it's a wonder that anybody doesn't have really strong food cravings or that anybody isn't eating disordered today. So I think I got up on a soapbox for a little bit in response to one question, but I'll pause and let you jump in.
No, it's good. I think it's interesting that the things that you're talking about are our brain responses and how the industry knows about those brain responses and they're able to use that to their advantage to help us buy the foods just from the simple colors. That we have an expectation when you have these dark purple colors that you're going to get polyphenols and anthocyanins because that's generally what's found in those type of foods that are that color. But you're not going to get the same just because a wrapper of a candy bar is also purple. And then also just the behaviors and what we've learned through living life can contribute to that. I think a great example is going to the movie. It's hard for people to go to a movie theater without getting a big Diet Coke and a box of popcorn and maybe some licorice or something to go with it because we've learned that. That's just the way we've lived.
Learned behavior. It's a learned behavior. Yeah.
I do want to jump into a little bit, though, just briefly on what are some of the ingredients or common food additives and ingredients that are added to foods that intensify our cravings?
We talked about color, how color signal the availability of micronutrients. And there are color enhancers like titanium dioxide, which is no longer considered safe in Europe, but it's okay in the US. It's legal in the US.
Mm-hmm.
And, so most of the packaged foods that you see will have, significant color enhancement to enhance your cravings. There is salt in just about everything these days. And most people, if you take the salt out of packaged foods, they might taste disgusting to you. There was a reporter who was invited to a testing. I think there were potato chips that had the salt removed, and he said it tasted like metal. So it turns out that the salt actually covers over a lot of the chemical tastes that are used to make things shelf stable and, or even enhance the flavor in other ways. Of course, sugar is rampant. High fructose corn syrup, artificial sweeteners. Interesting thing about artificial sweeteners, the studies seem to show that when you eat artificial sweeteners, they tend to reduce the number of calories you have at that meal, but they tend to increase the number of calories that you take in over the course of the day by about 22%. Ask yourself why that is. Well, the sweet taste is really a signal to your brain and your gut that here comes the fruit. That's the only sweet taste in nature is fruit, right?
Mm-hmm.
Here comes the fruit and here comes the fiber, and then the fruit and the fiber doesn't come. So you've stimulated the insulin response, you've stimulated, the mechanisms in your physiology that are getting ready to digest fruit, and the fruit doesn't come. So the brain is basically saying, where the heck is my fruit? And so you keep looking for more food all day long.
Mm-hmm.
There are things that are promoted under the label of innocent sounding natural flavors, which are really invisible ingredients that make your brain taste something that isn't really there. There are texture enhancers like potassium bromate. It's carcinogenic. It's added to bread to strengthen the dough and make it rise higher. That creates a stronger mouthfeel. It's one of those things that's also regulated in Europe, but still legal here. BHA and BHT are carcinogens. You'll find them in packaging and cans. And so those are some of the more common additives and ingredients. And there are dozens more. So it's not a good thing. We're not living in a healthy industry like that.
Right. You mentioned earlier something called the bliss point, and I think it's important that the listeners understand what this is and why it's such a powerful tool in making foods addictive. So can you explain just a little bit more about what the bliss point is and how that's used?
Well, your experience of pleasure in response to a flavor is not a straight line. It's not like a line that goes straight up like a
Mm-hmm.
mountain would, right? It's more like the more you add, it goes up and up and up and up, and then you get past the point and it starts to go down. So there is a revulsive reaction when you put too much sugar into something. People will say,
Mm-hmm.
"Oh, I can't eat that." There's a revulsive reaction when you put too much salt into something. Most people don't realize it's the same thing for vanilla and chocolate and cherry and strawberry. Um, there's a very specific amount which the brain will perceive as blissful, beyond which you're being counterproductive in terms of creating the craving. And it wouldn't surprise you that much of the $10 million that goes into these formulations is to figure out exactly where those bliss points are.
It's kind of like you hit diminishing returns. You get to this peak, right, where something is the most pleasurable it can be, and then you go a little past that, and you're over your point of pleasure, and you start to get those diminishing or negative returns. But it's an interesting concept when you discuss that with food and how that could play a role in our eating habits and what we choose to eat. I want to shift a little bit now into the brain and the way it's affected by the foods that we eat. So, how do these highly processed foods affect the brain and even the body differently than a whole unprocessed food would?
Well, they contribute to inflammation and they disrupt your blood sugar and they're providing minimal nutritional value. It's like what we talked about with regards to the artificial sweeteners. They're telling the brain, here's the good stuff, but it doesn't actually provide you the nutrition or the good stuff, so you keep wanting more and more. A bowl of strawberries is loaded not only with a sweet taste and a beautiful color, which comes from nature, but it's got guar and pectin and perfectly natural balance of fiber and nutrients, and coenzymes and cofactors that are designed to help you assimilate it in a steady and reasonable way. Like it's the perfect little package. There are actually treatments for diabetes that are derived from the guar and pectin in bananas and other kinds of fruits and vegetables. So most processed food removes the fiber. Most processed food concentrates the sugar, concentrate the other flavorful elements of the food, and it's like the difference between pornography and natural romance. There's an unnatural stimulation of the brain, which also leads to something called downregulation. If you eat a chocolate bar every day, by the end of 30 days, your taste buds and your pleasure systems are not going to respond to an apple the way that they would respond to an apple in the beginning, because your system has to downregulate the response to being hyperstimulated. Thankfully, it also works in reverse, and there's a process called upregulation. So if you can let go of a lot of these highly processed foods, or we teach people how to regulate them and have them play a smaller role in your life. You don't have to give them up entirely. If you can do that, then the good news is that things that did not taste good to you will start to taste good and better and better and better as the months go on. In fact, I think there's research that says that your taste buds double in sensitivity in 8 weeks' time if you stop having all the processed stuff. There's also research that says that highly processed foods cause depression and anxiety. It's bad stuff. It's bad stuff.
The fresher the food that we can eat and the less processed, obviously is going to be healthier for us. It's better. How about mindfulness? What role does mindfulness and maybe even deep breathing play in overcoming cravings? And how does this help address food addiction at a deeper level?
Well, food addiction is really generated from the feast and famine response. It's a reptilian response that is a kind of panicked, impulsive, compulsive drive towards getting as many calories as you can as quickly as you can, because there was a time in our evolution when it was not that easy to get and you had a lot of competitors. And that emergency response involves the activation of what we call the sympathetic nervous system. Fight or flight, feast or famine, eat, mate, or kill, right? And deep breathing and mindfulness takes you out of the sympathetic nervous system and moves you to the parasympathetic system, which is where you are when your brain says it's okay to rest and digest and breathe. A simple way to do this without spending 20 years contemplating your navel to learn how to meditate and everything is just to breathe in for a count of 7 and out for a count of 11. Do that a couple of times. Because if there were really an emergency, if a hungry bear was chasing you, you'd have to be going. But if there's no hungry bear chasing you, you have a chance to sit and breathe deeply. And when your system adjusts like this, when the parasympathetic system takes over and says it's okay to rest and digest, that's when you can use your rational brain. That's when it's okay to think about what you want to accomplish tomorrow and in 5 days or 10 days or 10 years. But there's no time to do that if your emergency system is active.
Mm-hmm.
One of the real things that we've discovered in order to be able to make use of this is to create a kind of a tripwire where our culture is frightened of having hard and fast rules with regards to food, and we can talk about the objections that people have to that. But if you're willing to at least adopt a temporary rule that's not set in stone that you can change later on, where you say something like, I'm not going to have chocolate during the week. I'll only ever have it on Saturdays after a workout and no more than 2 ounces. When you do that, you're creating an alarm to become more aware when there are thoughts in your head that suggest you should do otherwise.
Mm-hmm.
Because then all of a sudden, if it's a Wednesday afternoon and you're at, a coffee place and you hear this voice in your head that says, it's okay, you worked out hard enough today, even though it's Wednesday, you can start your silly rule again tomorrow. You can say, wait a minute, that's not me, that's my reptilian brain getting active. I don't eat chocolate during the week, so this is a good time for me to practice my deep breathing. And what you can also do after you've taken a couple of 7-11 breaths is you can ask yourself, well, how is my brain attempting to justify this? Let's see, it says it'll be just as easy to start again tomorrow. Is that true? And the way that the brain works, that's actually not true. Because if you have a craving for chocolate on a Wednesday and you say to yourself, I'll just start again tomorrow, and then you indulge in the chocolate, you'll have reinforced both the craving and the thought. So you'll be more likely to say, start again tomorrow, which is why you should always use the present moment to be healthy. And if you're in a hole, you got to stop digging. So we call that a rational refutation, and it goes hand in hand with the mindfulness and deep breathing in order to disempower the cravings. Does it make sense?
It does. I'm going to give you a scenario, and then I'm going to ask a question after the scenario. So say I go to a birthday party. They have cake and ice cream there, and the cake tastes so good that pretty soon I've got 3 pieces that I've eaten. And the ice cream just happens to be my favorite flavor. And so I've eaten 2 bowls of that. Okay, after this, I've obviously eaten way too many sweets and processed foods. What do you propose to help someone recover more quickly after they've succumbed to a craving like that for that highly processed food?
Sure. What I just want to say as a preamble to this is if you know that you're vulnerable to that, it works better to make your decisions before you go into the environment of temptation. So you could write down what would be an appropriate amount of cake and ice cream for me. And what would be an appropriate amount? How would I feel proud of myself tomorrow? Am I going to have one serving of each? Am I going to have a half a serving of each? And visualize yourself doing that before you go in, so that you're not you're not taxing your willpower at the moment of temptation. So that's my first piece of advice for that. But in terms of recovering, it's important to know a whole bunch of things. When you have destabilized your blood sugar, you're going to have more cravings the next day. You're going to be also in a worse mood the next day, because especially if you've been good for a while, quote unquote good, following your definition of good, when you indulge in the ice cream and the cake, it's going to feel much more exciting than it would if you were indulging every day. So you're going to get a bigger dopamine hit, and then you're going to get a bigger dopamine crash thereafter. And it's important to recognize you don't have to do anything about that. You just need to let it pass. People think there's something wrong. They're going to be tortured with these feelings forever. The cravings are going to be horrific forever. It's not true. The cravings will go away. What I recommend people do, if there's no reason that they can't have leafy green vegetables, is to blend up about a half a pound of tender leafy greens, romaine lettuce, spinach, not the harder ones to digest, and drink it down like medicine. Don't put a dressing on it. Don't make it sweet. Just drink it down like medicine. What this does is it reminds your brain where genuine nutrition is available. There are precious few dietitians that would recommend against leafy greens. There are some. Most, whether you're, of the Paleolithic or ketogenic variety, or if you're of a, whole foods plant-based variety, most would say leafy greens are a good idea. And so most people can do this, and it stops the craving for more. It kind of shocks the brain into saying, okay, you got attached to the cake and the ice cream. I know that you're craving more cake and ice cream now, but this is really where the good stuff is. This is almost a miracle. I discovered this by accident. It's almost a miracle. Then what you want to do is avoid high glycemic foods for a couple of days. High glycemic are, concentrated sugar, really white flour, white sugar. Even some of the higher glycemic fruits like grapes or very ripe bananas, probably better not to have for a couple of days, and focus on lower glycemic food like berries or lean proteins or beans or tofu or something like that, and eat plenty of vegetables so you stay full. Don't skip your meals. There's a temptation to over restrict in order to compensate, but you got to eat breakfast the day after a binge. You got to have breakfast the day after a binge, and don't go back into intermittent fasting right away. Take 2 or 3 days and eat. I should preface this by saying I'm not a medical doctor or a dietitian, so I'm giving a lot of dietary advice here. I have seen 2,000 people, and I've gone through a lot of recovery with people, so that's where this comes from. But I don't want to overstate my authority. So you do that. It's probably best if you write out the meals that you are going to have, so you don't have to think about them. Then if you keep a journal and set an alarm to go off every 3, 4, or 5 hours, and just write down what feels better. So in the beginning, it'll be like, oh, I feel like death warmed over, and there's bile in the back of my throat, and I feel so digestively uncomfortable, and I look really puffy, and I don't have any energy, and I feel really negative about everything. That's okay. Just write it down. Another 3 or 4 hours, the alarm will go off again. You say, well, I don't quite have that bile there anymore, and I'm a little less puffy. I need to drink a little more water. Just write down everything that's getting better slowly. What that does is it gives you something to focus on rather than the cravings. And it pulls you through, every couple of hours thinking, oh, I'm excited to see what's going to be better in 3 or 4 more hours. And that's a really cool tip to get through the recovery period. And then the last thing that you want to do is to write down what the thoughts were that got you to overindulge in the first place. Like, oh, hey, it's a party. There's no reason I can't break my rules, or I really deserve this. Write that down and then try to see what might be illogical about that. Your food monster usually wins with, that's what we call the reptilian brain. It usually wins by telling a half-truth with a bigger lie. And so you want to figure out what's true and where's the lie. Like it'll say that, you were good all day and you've had a really hard day and you really deserve a treat, you can say, well, I was really good all day and I really do deserve something. But what I deserve is to be free from cardiovascular worries, and I deserve to be present with my kids tonight, and I deserve to have the energy to work out in the morning, and the list of things that will ensue if you don't continue to have cake and ice cream. So you can logically disempower those types of negative voices. And that's a very short synopsis. I know we're going to run short on time soon. That's a very short synopsis of what I'd propose to help people recover more quickly after succumbing to the cravings.
Those are good suggestions, and I think it's important to what you said at the beginning to be prepared. If you know you're going to a birthday party and they're going to have the cake and the ice cream, make the decision now what portion of cake and ice cream you're going to consume while you're there. Another scenario might be, though, that you go over to a friend's and you don't know that they're going to have your favorite dessert or treat, and then they have it there sitting on the table and invite you to have some. And so what can somebody do that's in that moment where they weren't prepared for this craving and now they're experiencing it for this unhealthy food? What can they do in that moment?
You could have a standing plan. You could have a standing rule for what you do in social situations. Like when I'm offered an unanticipated dessert or dish, I can have a half a plate full, or I will always try to eat some protein before I go to a social event so that I'm not too hungry. You can have standing rules for dealing with unexpected situations. They're part of life.
Yeah, that's great. And I agree that protein, it does promote satiety, but it also is just metabolized differently than other nutrients in the body. It has a higher thermic effect, and so that can temporarily boost your metabolism. And there's just some differences in the way that the body processes protein versus fats and carbohydrates or other things. Good suggestion to maybe have a little bit of protein before you go to any social event, because the way we are as humans, we tend to have treats and processed foods when we gather at social events. And so just good to be prepared for that. I want to end with a question, which may be the most important question that I'm going to ask you. What steps can people take to build a healthier relationship with food in a society that is really designed to sabotage that relationship?
Well, I think you really need to define what healthy means for you purposefully. My grandfather used to say, if you don't know what you're aiming at, you're probably going to hit something else, which I think was a takeoff on Yogi Berra. But I find that it's very true. Most people, they go into these situations saying, I'm just going to try to be good, or they'll have their definition of healthy eating will be that I'm going to be good about 90% of the time, and I'll indulge myself 10% of the time. The problem with that, although it's theoretically good advice, is that there's no instruction for how to make the decision. When does the 90% of applying? When does the 10% of applying? And as a result of that, you're making food decisions all day long. Willpower is the ability to make good decisions. And so when you're forcing yourself through decision after decision after decision, you're unwittingly wearing down your willpower. So it's better to say, I only have chocolate on Saturdays and no more than 2 ounces, than to say, I avoid chocolate 90% of the time and I indulge 10% of the time. Because in the latter, you're forcing yourself to make chocolate decisions all day long and all week long. So sit down and make a list. And I have some worksheets and things people can use to do this. They're free at my website. Make a list of the troubling trigger foods and situations for you, or the troubling behaviors, and figure out what do you define as a healthier behavior in that situation, and try to encode it. Try to encode it in black and white so that you know what you're aiming for. Once you know what you're aiming for, step back and listen for the part of you that wants you to shoot off target. That's the tripwire we talked about that's going to wake you up. Take those 7-11 breaths when that happens, and then see if you can disempower the justifications that come once you are awake and you've jumped back right into your rational brain. That's a short story. I can offer people resources to learn more. that's a short synopsis of what I'd like people to do.
Well, Dr. Livingston, it's been a pleasure speaking with you and having this discussion, which I think is really important. There are just so many foods, particularly here in the United States in the typical American diet, that are intended to make us eat more and more of them because the food companies want to sell their products. And so they make them as addictive as possible and as desirable as possible in every way that they can. And so it's good for us to bring some awareness to that tactic, but also to help us learn how we can defeat those tactics by bringing awareness in our brain and doing certain exercises and being prepared like you've discussed. So I really appreciate the tips and suggestions that you've mentioned. You mentioned your website might have some free resources. If you wouldn't mind just maybe closing us out by sharing where people can find that and get that information from you.
Well, you can actually get a free copy of the book in electronic format at defeatyourcravings.com. Defeatyourcravings.com. Click the big blue button, you sign up for the reader bonuses, and that'll include a copy of the book in electronic format. It'll include a bunch of worksheets to walk you through identifying the triggers and making a plan to disempower these justifications and the cravings. And it'll also give you a set of full-length recorded coaching sessions. This is all free so that you can see how the process works in reality, because we went very quickly through a lot of different pieces and parts of it. And that way you can hear what it's actually like.
Great. Well, thanks for sharing that resource and for what you're doing to help people overcome these cravings and to have healthier relationships with food. I appreciate you taking time out of your evening to discuss with us and to meet with me.
Scott, I appreciate you having me on.
Thank you for sharing your time with us today. I hope you've gained insights to elevate your health and life. For more transformative evidence-based wisdom, I invite you to explore my 20-plus books at authorscott.com/shop. Don't miss out on the chance to supercharge your health and guide others to a better life. Like, share, and subscribe to join the movement transforming lives. Here's to your journey toward boundless health and happiness.